Hello, Students on Ice alumni. Welcome to our last session of the day for Wednesday. So this session we have Victoria Grant. She has been on 3 expeditions, if I'm correct, Victoria. It was 2018 Arctic, 2019 Arctic, and C3. So Victoria has a panelist right now. She's sharing the stage today with Marie Wilson and Bruce Lawson, and we're going to be talking about truth and reconciliation. So, Victoria, if you guys are ready to start off, I can leave it to you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to all of you who have joined us online today. Yes, I joined. My first trip with Students on Ice was the Canada C3 trip, and I went from Tuktoyaktuk around Alaska to Prince George. I was on the boat for 21 days, and it was a lot of fun, very interesting, and some rough seas. If anybody is online from that time, you will remember the rough seas. Tonight, I'd like to have a conversation with Bruce Lawson, who I've done some work with in the philanthropic community, and within, we've done some stuff around truth and reconciliation here in Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided went on from 2006 to 2015, and the final report and final event was in June of 2015. I think we've all done some work around truth and reconciliation, all of us online. Marie Wilson probably making one of the biggest commitments of her time. So tonight we're going to talk about it. It's been 10 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided its report, and we're going to look back and also to think about looking forward. And we will share some of our experiences with you. And then I should probably tell you who I am. I'm Victoria Grant, Teme-Augama Anishnabai, woman of the Deepwater people, my Hmong and Doden, so I'm a Loon Clan, and I hail from Northern Ontario, the Temagami area, in the sort of, I guess, a little north, but I know some people who would not consider it north because Students on Ice did a lot in the Arctic. So I'm south of the Arctic, but north of Toronto. I'm going to ask Marie to introduce herself, and then Bruce will introduce himself.
Thanks very much, Victoria, and hello to everyone. It's a wild and mysterious thing to be talking to a crowd when I can't see anyone, but I can feel your presence there, and welcome you all as fellow travelers, if I can put it that way. I'm speaking to you from Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. This is the homeland of the Dene Nation, and this particular community is on the homeland of the Willowday peoples of Chief Dragi's territory. This is Treaty 8 land, and my husband and extended family, are from farther north, just below the Arctic Circle, Treaty 11 territory in Radé-Licon, which is the Dene name for the community of Fort Good Hope. And I've lived here for well over 45 years now, but I'm originally from Southern Ontario, in the area of Petrolia-Sarnia, and very near the community of Anchenong in Anishinaabe territory. And most, I guess, Victoria's already mentioned this, but most relevant to you, served as one of the 3 commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, along with my colleagues, Justice Murray Sinclair and Chief Wilton Littlechild. In terms of students on ice, though I have not been actually on a student on ice tour, I was part of Canada C3. And I would say, pertinent to tonight's conversation, I was on the leg that started in Charlottetown, which is often referred to as the birthplace of Confederation, and traveled to St. John's, Newfoundland. So along those eastern coastline waterways. And I think it would be fair to say, and I think Jeff Green, whom you all know, would acknowledge, that that really was the leg where the theme of reconciliation became bedrock to all of the work of the Students on Ice program. We explored it as being foundational to everything else that was being talked about. And I'll go into a bit more detail on that in our conversation tonight. But the reason why I say that is because if you think about Charlottetown, and those of you who are students of Canadian schools probably learned about it as the Fathers of Confederation and all of that. And one of the things that my Dene husband was able to point out very graphically by his presence there at the same time was who's missing from the picture. And so when you think in the broadest possible terms about reconciliation, what does it mean today? One of the measures of that is who, if anyone, is missing from the picture when major decisions are being made that affect people's lives and well-being and identity and possibilities. So I hope we can dig more deeply into all of that. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
So I guess that turns to me. My name's Bruce Lawson. My lofty title at the moment is the Special Advisor at the Counseling Foundation of Canada. I used to actually be the President and CEO, but I stepped down nearly 3 years ago after 15 years of running the foundation. And the foundation is a private foundation, a privately endowed foundation, which focuses on the career development of young people from coast to coast to coast. And so I'm coming to you from Toronto. I am descended from English, Scottish, and Irish immigrants who came to Canada in the early 19th century. And I'm here in Toronto on Dish with One Spoon territory, traditional territory of the Anishnabai, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. But most treaties with the Toronto Purchase with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So the foundation actually, long before I took over the foundation, back in the mid-1980s, we gave our first grant to an organization. It was Lakehead University, where one of my predecessors, two predecessors who was running the foundation before me, gave a first grant from the foundation to the Native Students Association. So it was an Indigenous benefiting organization, but not an Indigenous-led organization. But I think Elizabeth, who was then in charge of the foundation, went up there to tell them all the reasons that they couldn't get a grant, discovered there was cultural apartheid on campus, and came back to the board and said, we have to give them money. And that started a long journey for us. I came into the role in 2008. Honestly, I knew of Indigenous peoples, but I really knew very little. And so it was a big sort of learning curve for me. But I think we'll get to that discussion as we get into it.
Thanks, Bruce. Noticeably missing tonight is I had invited a survivor to come and speak, and she was from my community. She was a young, she'd lost her mother, so her and her sister were both in the Spanish boarding school, residential school in Northern Ontario, and she spent a number of years there. But as she often says, she was lucky enough that her dad picked her up every summer, and she got to spend the summers on Lake Temagami. She is not. I guess what I would say, I apologize, but I think we have miscommunicated dates and times or flipped them around. But To begin, I'd like to ask Marie to talk a little bit about her work with the commission, about her experience, and then I'll follow about my engagement through philanthropy and how it brought me to SOI.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for acknowledging Patsy. And I think we all feel regret about her absence, but I certainly can tell you some things that I know about the Spanish residential school. It's one of the 150 that were acknowledged in various parts of Canada as having been residential schools that were part of the federal government's Indian residential school program. And it was mandatory schooling for Indigenous children that began. There were actually residential schools in Canada pre-Confederation in 1867, and it became government policy in 1876, and the policy in the last schools closed in the 1990s. So you may know those specifics, but just to remind us, if you haven't learned, or just as a reminder, that's over 100 years, well over a century of residential schooling for Indigenous children. And what that means is, first of all, questionable schooling in terms of quality of education, huge disruption to family and to kinship bonds, enormous geographic displacement. So Victoria just told you the story of Patsy, who was grateful that she got to go home for the summer. Many children did not, and especially in the earlier years, many stayed for years at a time, and so we're so disconnected from family and place and identity and all of those things that ground us as human beings and have us give a confident sense of who we are and what our purpose is and where we fit in. That was really disrupted for people. Well, what I want to tell you about the commission is that after, in the midst of, and while schools, in fact, were still operating, this is a story that really is about advocacy. It's about about courage. And it was the courage of residential school survivors themselves who decided as adults that what had happened to them and to their families and communities when they were children was not right, and that someone should be held to account for it. And so they used the Canadian legal system, which is, I think it would be important to say, one of the positive parts of the story, that we had a functioning legal system in Canada. And they brought their case against the federal government that set the residential school program in place, and against 4 of the national churches who ran residential schools on contract to the federal government. And one of those denominations was the Roman Catholic Church, and then the Spanish school that we've already named was one of the few, actually, that was run by the Jesuit order of the Roman Catholics. So it was particular in that way, and ran both a boys' residence and a girls' residence. The result of the court case, which was unprecedented not only in Canada but in the world, because it was the first time there had ever been a case and a settlement that acknowledged harms that were specific to children, of a particular ethnicity, in this case Indigenous children, that happened not as a result of war, but as a result of the government's own policies and laws. And that happened over a long, long period of time. So not the relatively short time frame that we think of military conflict, but rather over more than a century. So the case was brought forward alleging all of these harms. And the bottom line short version is that the Supreme Court of Canada agreed. And there was for expediency, because so many of the survivors at that time were already elderly, it was settled out of court. And one of the most important parts of the settlement was that there would be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so that there would be somewhere for the students, the survivors as they were called, to put their side of history on the record. And that became the platform, which was the most important piece of the work that our Truth and Reconciliation Commission did. We had a 5-year mandate that ended up being extended to 6.5 years. And we traveled to all parts of the country, and we recorded statements, lived experiences, really, from close to 7,000 former residential school students, in some cases, their offspring, their children, often referred to as intergenerational survivors. And in a relatively few number of cases, but important ones, we also heard from people who worked in the schools, some of the staff who ran the schools, and some of the religious leaders of the schools. But mostly it was survivors who spoke to us and told us about what their childhoods had been like, what the consequences of the schools had been for them, and what they felt they needed in order to begin to move forward in a new way. And the terminology that was used was truth and reconciliation. And that was taken, I think, largely from the example that a lot of people have known about from South Africa when they were putting an end to apartheid. But it was called Truth and Reconciliation because it was really clearly articulated that they wanted the sharing of their stories to contribute to the healing of themselves and their peoples, and to contribute to a new spirit of good relations and reconciliation between themselves and all Canadians. And that's the work that we started as a commission. And that is the big work that is continuing now under the banner of reconciliation, and where all of you, each in your own way, fit in. Maybe I'll just leave it at that for now, Victoria.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. And it's interesting because in 2008, we also, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were doing its work, and I was involved in the philanthropic community at the time, and in 2008, there was a number of us who worked in the philanthropic community who were working with Indigenous organizations or were Indigenous and were in philanthropic organizations. And there was a discussion about how much of philanthropic dollars was going into Indigenous communities for the benefit of Indigenous people. And at the time, we did the group of us did a very short research project, and I think it was 0.8% of all philanthropic dollars was going into Indigenous communities, and of that 8%, 80% of that 0.8%, 80% of those funds were being administered by non-Indigenous organizations for Indigenous peoples, and it was a group of us who started to have a conversation, and we invited a number of people to Winnipeg, philanthropic leaders, and we actually, for the first time, a number of them had participated in an Indigenous ceremony. The interesting thing out there was it just happened to be at the same time that Stephen Harper made his public apology to Indigenous survivors, and that was the beginning of the work that we started to do, and thinking about engagement, relationship. At the time, we weren't using the term truth and reconciliation. We were just talking about how limited those funding dollars were made available to Indigenous communities. Out of that came an organization called the Circle on Philanthropy, and that came about in 2011. And again, by then, if you read the Globe and Mail, there was starting to be articles in the Globe and Mail on a daily basis almost of what was happening from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself, and some of the stories were starting, people were starting to be aware. So we were there was kind of this synergy of working side by side. And out of that, I was sat on a number of boards, and I actually worked as the executive director for the circle for part of that time, but it was a continual evolvement of engagement. I'm going to let Bruce talk a little bit about one of the projects that we both participated in, but I eventually became, I was eventually on the board of directors for the Community Foundations of Canada, was the chair of the board when Canada C3 was being organized. And the talk about what Canada, each of those, so Canada 3C had 15 different legs, what they called. Mm-hmm. And in those 15 different legs, I would tell you that there was a microcosm of Canada all happening in amongst those 50 or the 40 people that were participating in those legs. And it was a really, because we were focused on our section in leg 12, we had Bill Wilson, Chief Bill Wilson, and his wife, Bev, and I'm going to lose Bev's last name.
Sellers.
Bev Sellers, and she wrote 2 books, but her first book was They Called Me Number One, and really it was her story of her time in Williams Lake and the residential school there. So that's kind of my journey to really getting engaged with Truth and Reconciliation, and how some of my life growing up, I grew up in a community where there was high tourism, there was local residents were the primary our primary economic dependency was on mining and the taking of natural resources, and our community was kind of in the middle of a lake, and so in that we had a land claim, and there was a lot of unrest and dissension amongst those groups. And I was part of a group of people who started what we call the Temagami Community Foundation, which we started to host conversations to build community. And again, it was prior to Truth and Reconciliation in the final report, but it was all, I sometimes think I've lived talking about truth in the sense of what Indigenous people in this country have been exposed to all the way through, and secondly, trying to build a community and a healthy community around me all those years. So it has been an interesting journey, and it continues. And I really believe at this point there is some change. But Bruce, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about your way into Truth and Reconciliation.
Thanks, Vicki. So as I said, I grew up in downtown Toronto, or in Toronto, and I will say that growing up, I learned some Canadian history, and occasionally Indigenous people would show up in Canadian history. But it was very much, as I reflect on it now, it was much like Thomas King's book, The Inconvenient Indian. And I would say that I was more conscious of the mythical Indian, which was the media images of cowboys and Indians. Nothing tangible. I did not know any Indigenous people until 2008. I took over the foundation, And I guess it was early 2009, I was starting to meet our grant recipients, and we'd given a grant to a university on the West Coast that was doing a program that was called Walking in Two Worlds. It was for Indigenous students learning, I think, masters in psychology. And so it was about traditional knowledge and Western knowledge. So I go into a 1-hour conference session and thinking I'm going to learn all about this program. And the person leading the session says, well, we should get to know who's in the room first. And so they, sort of passed the microphone around. There were probably 30 people in the room. And the first person took 5 minutes to tell where they were, where their people had come from, how they had migrated from place to place. And at about the 45-minute mark, I got my turn. I, sort of said, I'm Bruce Lawson, I'm here to learn, and passed it along to the next. But at the 50-minute mark of a 60-minute session, we finally got to the session topic, and they said, well, that's it. We don't really have time to tell you much about the session. And I was, a little bit frantic, thinking, and everybody walked out of the session thinking that this was the greatest session. And I thought, what is it about me that I'm not understanding that this was not, that this did not meet my expectation? I was a little bit mystified, but it actually set me on a journey to try and understand more and realized I was the outlier, and it made me curious about what had transpired in that room and why it made sense to everybody else and not to me. Which gets into the relational nature of Indigenous peoples versus Western culture, which can be very transactional. So soon thereafter, I happened to meet with a colleague of the McConnell Foundation, one of the big foundations in Canada. They're located in Montreal. And we started talking. He'd never heard of our foundation and wondered if we had ever done anything in the Indigenous sphere. I said yes for 25 years at this point. And it got us into a collaboration with a number of organizations where we were trying to uncover promising and wise practices in Indigenous learning from coast to coast to coast, from early childhood education through to workplace. And it was on this sort of 2-year journey of trying to uncover these promising and wise practices that Vicky came into my life. Vicky was brought in as one of the Indigenous advisors of this initiative, and it was a 2-year endeavor. We had a lot of false starts, but gradually we got there. And one of the things that I learned along the way, and it gets back to the conference session that I mentioned, was the importance of situating yourself and building relationships with people before you do the work. Most of, I will say from my perspective, I usually sort of jump in and let's talk about the work, and we'll make a relationship along the way. But very much the tradition of Indigenous peoples is who are you? Who are your people? How do you situate yourself within the land? And what are your worldviews? And then once we've established that there's a connection, we can move quickly from there, as opposed to being very transactional and trying to build the relationship and understanding along the way. So it was a 2-year journey, and as Vicky said, out of that came the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples. I'd also say that in the context of this, I went to the TRC event. There was one of the big TRC events was in Edmonton in about 2013, and I was sitting in the plenary hall, and survivors were giving testimony in front of the commissioners and in front of an audience. And these were stories that were harrowing, They were haunting and things that you just could not unhear. Once you'd heard them, there was no way to sort of take an eraser to your brain and pretend that this had not happened. This so profound in what these survivors were saying, whether they were the actual survivors or the intergenerational survivors that Marie talked about. And it really, at that point, there were more of us working in philanthropy around working with Indigenous organizations and starting to work less with non-Indigenous led organizations benefiting Indigenous peoples, but trying to work with Indigenous led organizations that would allow them much more sovereignty and say over how resources were deployed. In late 2014, Justice Sinclair, chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, came to a Philanthropic Foundations Canada conference and was the keynote speaker. And during his keynote, he challenged the philanthropic community to do something. And I know Marie was also in those conversations. There were a lot of conversations happening behind the scenes, but what Justice Sinclair said was that he wanted us to do something concrete. There had been a lot of statements from people as witnesses, but he wanted philanthropy to take action. And recognizing that many of the foundations that exist may have been built in part based on natural resources, and whose land was that was taken. It was something that we wanted to challenge us to do something concrete about working with Indigenous peoples, not in continuing to, I'll say, inflict work on Indigenous peoples. And so a group of us started coming together and started the idea of creating a declaration of action that we could present at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as most things, it's always good to have a deadline. So that we had a deadline of the closing event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to work towards. But what we needed also was a declaration that was broad enough for people in the organizations in philanthropy to take that step. Something that acknowledged their current work. It could be an entry point for people who were not yet had in relation with any Indigenous communities. And it had to be both meaningful but easy to participate, so a low barrier to entry. And so a small group, probably a group of about 7 or 8 of us, and again, who did we turn to but Vicky? All roads lead to Vicky, it seems. And so, but we also had the sort of the associations in philanthropy working with us, because we didn't want it coming from individual foundations. We wanted it from the community of organizations. And we worked collaboratively. We had a communications consultant who was Indigenous, who was doing the writing for us. And at one point, a couple of us decided that we actually needed to take it back, because he couldn't speak on our behalf, just as we could not speak on his behalf. So we needed to actually take charge of the language this was our declaration to the survivors and to Indigenous peoples. It was not about his language and an Indigenous person making a declaration on behalf of philanthropy. So I'll say that's a nutshell. And Vicky, I don't know if that I'll stop there. But the declaration of action we presented on stage in June of 2015 at the closing event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'll say we finished the declaration 3 weeks before, writing the declaration 3 weeks before the event. Then we had to get people to sign it. And we weren't sure who would sign it. I think we knew that we would have 15 signatures going into it. And miraculously, the night before, we had a dinner and we got about 30 signatures that night, even from organizations who had no mandate to sign it from their board of directors. They just decided they'd sign it and, deal with the consequences later. But no buyer's remorse for many of them that I've ever heard.
It was a good thing, and it brought people together in a way that began a conversation that still continues today.
I remember that dinner. I spoke at that dinner, actually.
Yeah.
You gifted me a beautiful miniature birch bark canoe, which I still treasure, and a copy of the Declaration. I remember it very fondly.
It was a lovely evening, and people, I think people still think of that day, but it was, and it was the beginning. I'm going to say this because 5 years after, COVID came, and what happened is Bruce came to our board. I sit on the board of the Counseling Foundation. I'm actually chair of the board of the Counseling Foundation now, which is a family organization. And I think I'm the first family member that
Non-family. You're the first woman and the first non-family member.
And it always felt right to be at that table. But the thing that was interesting is Bruce came to the board and asked for $200,000. He didn't know what it would be used for, but he did say he wanted to be a part of a conversation or be a part of something that was going to support Indigenous peoples through COVID. And by the end of that week, he had more conversations with people outside of our organization. By the end of that week, he had a commitment of $1.5 million.
Wow.
To doing something. And then Wanda and I and Bruce and Nicole, there was one other person.
Probably Andrew Tunalal. So Wanda had been the executive director of the Circle for a number of years. And Nicole McDonald was at the McConnell Foundation at the time, and Andrew Tunalal at Community Foundations of Canada.
So
we were
Go ahead.
So we were all, I started talking to some of my colleagues who worked at foundations, and we were getting, I was getting calls from every organization in Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, asking us for money. The people I wasn't hearing from were, Baker Lake, Attawapiskat, Ganawage, Kanchikam. No Indigenous organization came to us and sort of said, COVID's here and we're struggling. And pretty quickly, once the lockdowns happened, if you were in a First Nation next to a town, the towns actually often closed off the border. And if you were in a First Nation and part of your food security was accessing the food bank in that local community, in the local town, all of a sudden there was a barrier to you accessing. And so food security became a huge issue. And I remembered back to the last time there had been a pandemic, which was MERS, I think Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And the federal government had sent body bags to First Nations. No support, they just sent body bags, which was pretty harrowing. And so, as Vicky said, I just said to the board, I need some money and I'm not sure what it's for yet. And it just started, but I needed it to be able to say to others, I have money put in this if you'll come with me. And thankfully, we had done a lot of work in the philanthropic sphere of engaging with Indigenous peoples, with Indigenous leaders. And the moment that I said it to anybody, they all said, "Oh yeah, we should do that." There was no thought that, well, why would we do that? They all knew how disadvantaged and the lack of access to capital that communities would have, and therefore that this was the right thing to do. And of course, as I said, all roads lead to Vicky. And so I enlisted Vicky and Wanda, who had been running the circle. We got into conversation, and this had to be Indigenous led. And so, God bless them, in 10 weeks, this germ of an idea of an Indigenous led fund to support Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast was born, with a complete Indigenous advisory circle, and starting on day one with $1.5 million, and soon thereafter $5 million.
It was pretty exciting, and it continues today. Maria, I'm going to ask you if you want to talk a little bit about where you are and what you think about going, where we're going in this. What not what you see for the future, but what do you where are you, and what do you think about where we are today and going into the future?
Well, I find myself there's so many things that both you and Bruce have raised that I would like to jump on and sort of add PSs to, but what I'm trying instead to do is just think about who is joining us for this conversation today, and what is the connective tissue that we have among us all. And we've all one way and another, as alumni, including myself as adopted alumni to Students on Ice, since I've never actually done Students on Ice, but I know that Canada C3 was in the same spirit. It was a call to something that was based in our world's natural environment, that was based on science, that was based on the pristine nature of waterways and passageways and the history that got written as a result of those pathways, but also about identity. And the identity of peoples as they relate to lands and waters, and about the relationships built on board among peoples who came on board as strangers and left as probably in some cases lifelong friends. But also because the focus is on young people. People entered Students on Ice as young people. And at that stage of our lives, and I'm speaking now as an older person, but at that stage of our lives, that is the time of our life for figuring ourselves out as individuals and having our individual adventures and our individual journeys. And 25 years later, individuals become adults who live in communities, who define themselves far more so by community, whether that's community of family, your own family, or whether it's community of workplace, or whether it's community of colleagues, or people committed to common cause. And so I'm just trying to think about that kind of experiential journey that we've all been on in that amount of time. And in the meantime, what has happened in the world itself in that same time period? I'm thinking about, for example, specifically in the context of the TRC, the number of residential school survivors who talked about one of the greatest hardships for them being rupture from language, rupture from their homelands, rupture from traditional foods, rupture from traditional teachings about how to be self-sufficient and sometimes in extremely harsh environments, including the Arctic environments that have been a feature of student on ice expeditions. How to know how to be safe and sound in those kind of environments, and to be in harmonious relationship with lands and waters that are not always easy or welcoming to be in relationship with, and yet having to know how to respect each other so that you can stay alive and thrive. So I'm thinking about that bigger journey. I'm thinking about the world of our environment, the number of people who have over the years, not just with my time with TRC, but as a longtime journalist, talked about the importance of things like fish camp, going to fish camp, and how that was a rite of passage and part of coming of age, or your first hunt or your first kill on the land, and how today going out on the land is dangerous because, forget students on ice. We're talking about a world that is on thin ice. We're talking about waterways that have dried up to the point where I live, barges that our food supply, food security, Bruce, as you've been discussing, have been at peril because with no roads, barges have not been able to navigate down one of the biggest watersheds in the entire planet, certainly in North America, because water levels have been so diminished. And I had an elder ask me the question, how do you transfer knowledge, and do you even continue the practice of going to fish camp if there are no more fish? These are profound questions that have to do with, I think, the heart of the matter of what is Students on Ice and what was its mission. And of course, it was an excellent adventure for young people who are ripe for that. But it was also a challenge, I think, for each of us on those expeditions to really think hard about um, um, who are we in relationship with our best selves? Who are we in relationship with each other? And who are we in relationship with the lands and waters that have both been our source of navigation and of sustenance for all these millennia? So that's what I find myself thinking about in this 25th anniversary year. And how does it tie in with reconciliation for me? And as we said in our final reports, TRC reports, we talked about reconciliation as relationship. And in our reports, we specified, because that was in the aftermath of a program that was all about assimilation and assuming that one group knew what was best for another group of people, and that everybody needed to act and behave like white men. That's what the policy papers actually said. If that was a goal of total assimilation, what does it mean to stand back from that, to learn the lessons of that, to acknowledge honestly and with humility the devastation of all of that, and to say, no, instead, we should be in respectful relationships with each other. What does that mean? And in the years since the commission, over the last 10 years, I've found myself thinking more and more about relationships are not just between Indigenous peoples and other Canadians. They are also that more profound Indigenous understanding or perspective of relationship as also being relationship with all living things, with all that we live with and among and interact with, and that includes our natural environment. So those are the things that I find myself thinking about. And so finally, to come to your specific question, what I've been doing with all these thoughts that continue to preoccupy me since the commission is that I so much want all of the beautiful work that has been done, all of the courageous sharing that has happened, and all of the inspiration that has come from that. And Bruce has given some good examples of that, and so have you, Victoria. I want that not to be lost, and I want that not to be forgotten. And I want the heroes of that story really to be named and to be known. And so doing what I felt I could do is I wrote a book about it to talk from a firsthand perspective what was this commission? Why did Canada, of all places, a so-called developed Western world, why did we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, unprecedented in the world? I wanted that to be known and remembered and to be understood, so that those, including some of the younger people who are on this call, will understand this is not a story from the past. This is a story from our present day reality, and it is a continuing and unfolding story in which we now need new heroes to step forward. We need a new generation of courage and heroic action to say, first of all, we won't allow things to slide back to the worst they could ever have been, but we also will continue to do, each of us in our own ways, what we can to keep us going on a path forward towards more respectful relationships with each other and with all living things, in that spirit that Bruce talked about right at the very beginning, that course that he first took about walking in two worlds.
Very good. Bruce, what's your reflections?
So I'm very conscious of how much from that initial conference session where I was sort of the outlier, the kind of work that it took me to build meaningful relationships with different Indigenous peoples, you, Vicky, Wanda, through the work that I've done, trying to enter in a way that is not, here is what we want, it's how can we support you? You know your community, you know what you're doing, and what is it that you need that I can do to support? So recognizing that as a white man, I do not have the answers for all. And those ways of trying to impose solutions on communities never work, and just lead to bad outcomes and lead to failure. So I think about the importance of building relationships with people, the importance of collaboration, and how working together is both more enriching, but it creates impact. No actor alone is going to solve the problems of society. It takes a collective approach, and people coming at problems from different angles and talking about them and discussing them and figuring out solutions that are meaningful. And a lot of what as we're thinking about reconciliation, as we're thinking about building relationships, this is systems change work. And some of the problems that we're trying to deal with have been entrenched for over a century through the residential school system, through colonization. These are not things that you can overcome overnight. They take time, they take relationship building, and we need places where there can be open and honest conversations, and where people have the ability to be vulnerable and say, I don't know. I've not walked a mile in your shoes. Can you help me? Can you help lead me there? And can we walk there together? So it's about reconciliation really as a practice, an ongoing practice. I'm not, I don't know, there won't be a magical day when, look, we've made reconciliation happen. It's going to be ongoing work. It's about building relationships between people, and building a more just and equitable society.
It's interesting, when I think of your remarks, Marie, about the land and the relationship to land. And I look back at how, in some ways, for us, when we started the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, what had happened is when we first started to provide money out of that, it was all going to food security. And what Mary Simon said, you know, it's good that we have this money to give for food, but isn't it sad that in 2020 we're giving out this money for food? But the interesting thing that took a turn, and some of the when I think of the youth and how people in community all of a sudden decided, wait a minute, we can use this as food justice, food sovereignty. So all of a sudden there were gardens being built. There were taking kids back back out on the land, learning to hunt, learning to fish, and it, you know, it was remarkable, and how they like to tell the story. Because at the time we decided that we're not going to have to. What we said is community knows what community needs. So our criteria was, you just have to kind of tell us your story when you're done. But what we did say is, we use that term, take what you need, use all of it, and leave some for those coming behind you. And when they were asking for what they needed, and it was amazing the commitment that people made. Like, we would get calls saying, we're not going to spend all our money, because we were able to do this because people got involved. We got some volunteers, and now, would you like us to send the money back? And we would say, no, do more of what you're doing. But it was and there was a food program that they were getting $100,000 or $50,000 from some food program at Canada Food something. I can't remember the full name of the organization. And they felt more responsibility for that $35,000 that they were getting from us, that they spend it right and use it right, than they did for the other money that they were getting. And it was because we weren't questioning what they were going to spend that money on, or we weren't asking them if their community really needed it, or giving them ideas on how they could spend that money. And I just go back to when Marie, you talked about the importance of youth. One of the things I see in those trips in 2018 and 2019, I think I learned more from youth than I learned any place else, while there were a bunch of adults, and I think we were all learning. So when we did an art camp at Bear Island, we had all these kids. We were thinking, okay, we're going to do reconciliation. We didn't think about, we were going to build community and get the kids to know each other and build relationships with the kids. So we had all these kids come from the tourism community, from the mainland, and they all came to our community, the reserve, and they were all working. But we also had all these adults who didn't know each other, didn't know anything about our community, and what they were learning, that was an unexpected outcome. And I think sometimes when you're doing these things, that's where you see relationship and collaboration, and that kind of community building is so important. And I it's kind of what I get excited when I see that kind of stuff happening, and you don't expect it to happen, or you didn't. That was an unanticipated outcome. And I look at my time with Students on Ice and the work I've done since Student on Ice, and the connections that I made with the people on Students on Ice, both from we could not have invited as many Indigenous people to that first meeting when we did IPRF if I had not gone on Students on Ice. because it was that expanded my network of understanding, because all these people were community-minded people that, you know, there was, they were engaged. So it was easy to reach out and say, can you give me a recommendation, or would you consider? And it was just incredible. So it is opening. I guess it's, for me, it's about building relationships, but it's also taking advantage of the doors that open for you in this work and moving forward.
Can I pick up on that to say something,
Yes.
Victoria? It's just, you know, I've often said, you know, in our mandate with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the only element of our mandate that very specifically said it goes beyond the 5-year term, because our mandate was a 5-year term, and it did get extended by a year and a half, but it was a term project, except for the word reconciliation itself. And it very specifically said that reconciliation is an ongoing individual and collective process. So it's not a project, it's not a thing, it's not a one time, it's an ongoing process, and it involves residential school survivors and their families, the government, the churches, and staff and families who ran the schools, and this is the part I always stress, and the people of Canada. So in other words, all of us. And ongoing individual, collective, and all of us. And the reason I zero in on that is because I loved what you said, which is about how doing this work has enriched your network, has expanded your network. And sometimes, you know, people who sort of are forced into a conversation or into this issue because they have to, or it's an assignment, or it's a must do, or whatever. I'm assuming everybody on this call is voluntary, so I'm assuming that's not this group, but it is its own blessing. That is my point. The work in the broadest possible field of reconciliation is its own blessing and brings so many rewards that it's not like it's a thing you've got to plug your way through, but rather something that you can enter into knowing, man, this is going to be amazing. I'm going to meet people I've never met before. I'm going to hear things I've never heard before. I'm going to discover things I've never known before. And that is so enriching. And that is the broad banner work of ongoing reconciliation. So I completely agree with you on that. And the other thing I would just say, to piggyback on something that Bruce said earlier in talking about the work, the philanthropic world, and the work of supporting and learning to adjust from here's what we have for you, but rather to say there's support available. What is it that you need? So to put yourself in a way in the supportive role rather than the leading role. Yes, that is right. I think that is absolutely true and essential regarding Indigenous communities. But I do also, and I must say increasingly, think that some attention has to be given to the work that needs to be done in broader society as well, under the banner of reconciliation. And I just think about, for example, everyone's alert to yesterday's budget and what does that all mean, and all of these big projects. And where are all those rare earth minerals anyway? And on whose homelands will we find them? And what is the relationship building that has happened, if at all, in advance of that? And who will benefit from those things? And those are issues of, I used the word before, advocacy. Those are issues of citizenship, and those are issues of value-based thinking rather than transaction-based thinking. I met, I mean, in the spirit of the amazing things that happen under the broad banner of reconciliation, I've met so many beautiful people. And one of the people who said something that I've never forgotten, it was just so succinctly put, and it was an elected politician, doesn't matter who it was. they said, one of the challenges we have, and he was talking from the perspective of non-Indigenous mainstream, as it were, Canada. They said is when we are talking about an issue, non-Indigenous people, he was generalizing, think in terms of contracts and transactions. What is the contractual arrangement here? Whereas the Indigenous worldview is more about what is the relationship here? What is the relationship? And so he said we end up often talking past each other because we're not talking about the same thing. One is about a deal and the other is about a relationship. And so the reason I say all that is because I think part of the work we need to do broadly as a society and as a Students on Ice alumni community as well is where none of us are one-trick ponies. We wear many hats, and one of the hats we wear is as citizens and as influential individuals or groups who can speak up and speak to what we know and what we have learned and what we believe in. And that includes advocating for fair-minded policies, for fair-minded approaches, so that the starting position isn't starting with having to say you're sorry for something and clean up a mess. The starting position is to say, who are we in relationship with, and what would be a respectful way of approaching whatever the issue is at hand, so that we're going forward in a new value set that's not winner take all, but rather, how do we make this be truly meaningfully win-win?
Bruce, any
You're here.
comments?
I'd say that you put more succinctly some of the transactional nature of how I used to approach this work. The fact is that we're all treaty people. I think most Canadians forget. They think of things as Indigenous issues where they are issues for all of Canada. That these are things that will make or break this country, frankly. And that there is, what I'm looking at south of the border right now is very much an approach that is a zero-sum approach. I get, you don't. That's very focused on me, as opposed to a rising tide floats all boats. And so I think about, you're right, I didn't hear anything yesterday in the budget coverage about Indigenous peoples. This is all a rush to build a more resilient economy. But in doing so, how do we do it in a meaningful way that lifts all people in Canada? And I'm mindful, I sat on the advisory committee of an Indigenous studies program at one point, and they said, oh, we're happy to take your money, but we won't take it from natural resource companies. And I said, well, where do you think the foundation's money was made? It was based on natural resource extraction years ago. Yes, it looks cleaner now, but on whose land did we make that money? And so what's our duty and responsibility now to make good on that?
Very good. So when we think about where we are and what we're doing, what if you had one thought that you think would change our direction? What is it? When I think, I often used to say, somebody would often say to me, what do you think will make the single biggest change that you think Canada needs to make in relationship to reconciliation or in relationship to Indigenous peoples? And I often used to respond that before I die, I'd like to see the Indian Act gone. And the conversation always get, well, what would we replace it with? Like, what would we do without it? And this is both in an Indigenous conversation and a non-Indigenous conversation. And my answer always is, well, it's 2025. Surely we have some minds that can think a little differently than they did, that can reflect a little more of what we want in that relationship that wrote, for those people who wrote the Indian Act. What about, do we not have minds that can create a new type of legislation that would create something better that speaks about relationship? And of course, that's what the treaties were, right? It was about relationship in those treaties. And Marie, it's interesting because when you talked about contracts, my husband often would say, well, a treaty is a contract, and we can, they're all broken contracts. And if we're looking at it from a Western perspective, we should be able to and of course, that's partly what land claims and all that stuff is about. But how do you, I guess one of the things when I think about what I want for the future is I want to be able to have open conversation and relationship and I want my children to be able to be who they want to be without the feeling that they don't belong, I guess is basically ultimately what I would like. But what do you see in the future? I mean, I don't see this happening in my generation. I don't see it happening in my kids' generation, but I'm hoping that it changes over those generations, so that kids 3 and 4 generations out have a healthier place, a better place where these stories are still told, but they're told as in the past, with building a better future. Either one of you.
I'll take that, because I think, Vicki, I wouldn't give up on your generation. I look at my 97-year-old father and 89-year-old mother and how their viewpoints have changed over the last 15 years tremendously, and how much more interest they've taken in the work of reconciliation and the work of the foundation, trying to build relationships and meaningful relationships. So I think it's not, yes, the younger generation will probably do it faster, but I think we have to focus on everybody as being an entry point or a gateway towards building better relationships. I don't think we can always just foist it on the next generation. It's incumbent on every generation of every age. And I think I'm looking at our mouse pad. So when we did the Declaration of Action, one of the parting gift was a mouse pad, which is a short form of the Declaration in Action. And I think this is sort of a way in which people can think about, we separated it down into 3 sections with 7 teachings, but first is to learn and remember, the second is to understand and acknowledge, and then the third is to participate and act. So the incumbency upon people to actually learn about the history of Canada, the true history of Canada, and to understand it and acknowledge it before moving to action. I think, not jumping into action without actually understanding the context of what happened in this country.
So I think, first of all, I really want one of those mouse pads, Bruce.
I think they're a collector's item now.
They're a bit of a collector's item now.
All right. Well, you must know someone you could steal one from. But anyway, the very question, that you ask, Vicki, what is the thing you would change? I forget your exact wording, but basically, if there was one thing, for me, there is no one thing. There's a whole bunch of things, just as I don't think there is a singular correct meaning or translation for the word reconciliation. I don't think it has a single meaning, and you either get it right or you get it wrong. I think it's the messiness of living and trying multiple things and trying with good intention. That part I think is a constant to get things right, and the humility to pause and take note when things don't work out as intended, not as you wanted necessarily, but as intended, and then to not give up and to keep trying. So I say that because I don't think any longer, and maybe I did at one point, that we're going to get to there as if it's an end point.
Yeah.
And for one thing, as I was saying earlier, why would you want something that is so beautiful and inspirational to end? That's, if you're truly engaged in it, why would you want that to end? But also, I really do think much more now in terms of things being circular rather than linear, because that's what my understanding of history in my lifetime has taught me, that wherever I go, whatever context I'm in, there are always people who are extraordinary and amazing and who lead in various ways. And there are people that are a pain in the butt, and you have to find your way to live with them and work with them and whatever. And that may be something that changes, by the way, on a daily basis in your own household, or it may be in your workplace, or it may be in your political leadership. Things are not static, and none of us are perfect, and no circumstance is perfect. So things ebb and flow. But I think if the wave is moving in the right direction, then there's hopefulness in that. And it's what I've tried to capture in my book, which, if time allows at the end, I'll tell you the title of it if anyone's interested in it. But what I think is that, if I were to try to summarize in a sentence the gist of what your question is really getting at, I would move us from thinking about things as being contracts to being covenants. I think the spiritual intent of that is that is the disservice we do to ourselves as a human species when we throw that away. Like everything's just a deal and move on to another, whether that's a human relationship or, well, we wrecked that forest, let's go tear down some other forest, or, whatever else we killed off that species, so now let's rely on or let's try to genetically recreate something or other else. Like we've been so destructive in our patterns of interaction. And I think if we were somehow able to see the sacred nature of creation, all creation, including ourselves within it, and could frame contracts to be more towards covenants and true promises, maybe we could hold ourselves to a higher level of behavior and of interaction. And one of the things that I really would pick up on is what you said for your own wish for your own children and grandchildren. It definitely is mine. I mean, my children are biracial and have been raised with a proud Indigenous identity. That's how they first and foremost see themselves. And my work has been to help them feel absolutely that they belong and are perfect just as they are, and that they belong fully and have every right to a good life, as you say, and to be welcomed where they are. One of the things that I think is one of the huge gifts of the Student on Ice program and Canada C3 is its multi-generational nature. I think it's one of the things we are struggling with as a world. We have subdivided ourselves terribly by apps and by social media and by even by educational models that separate us from our multi-generational long history of depending on each other and having responsibilities to each other across the generations. Whether we are an elder or whether we are a parent or whether we are a child or whether we are the provider or the protector, or whether we are the the teacher, we have interdependencies within our oldest models of living together. And I think we have paid a huge price for separating ourselves from each other to the point of almost not knowing each other, not knowing how to talk to each other, not knowing how to talk about each other. And I think that that's corrective work that needs to happen. And I think every time there's a forum that allows voices of multiple generations to be heard, not one as better than the other, but all as having something valuable to bring, we are overall enriched by that. And the final thing that I would just say, and this is one, if there is one lasting and enduring gift of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I hope it is this, is that we will never again go silent on these issues, and the voices that were structurally and systematically silenced will never again be silenced. And those of us who have had to unlearn and relearn, and Bruce has talked a lot about that, that we will not allow ourselves to go silent either, and that we will speak up for what we do now know and know better, and that we will insist that our schools are teaching our children far better than any of us were ever taught, so that cone of silence, which allows for evil things to happen unchecked, will not permeate in our schools and in our society. And we are seeing examples of that in the south of the border, where people are cowering in response to excessive power, cowering and biting their tongues and accepting the intolerable as a survival technique. And I think we have to stand together and make sure that our voices are loud and proud and solid. And I definitely hope for that. And if I can allow one PS, I think one of the most common stories that we heard throughout the commission, there were many, and I talk about all of them in my book, North of Nowhere. It's called Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner. But one of the things we heard about far, far, far too often, as a consequence of the schools and as a consequence of the systemic structures that deprive opportunity, is poverty. And poverty is it's an incredible form of violence. And as long as there's rampant poverty, and violence flows from that, both psychological violence, but also eventually practical violence, as people try to find ways to stay alive. I think we really have to find ways to address that.
Very good. So one of the things that I'm, we're coming to the end of our time shortly, and I would like to talk a little bit about recommendations or things that we might want to share with people that would give them some sense of, or to give them some sense of the things that they should do. And Marie, I think it would be an opportune time for you to talk about the name of your book. And I actually would like you to tell the story of why the name of the book.
Hang on, it's right here. I'll just grab it.
Yeah, I think there are lots of great books out there.
Here, I'll show you. I'll show you a picture of it. It's called North of Nowhere, Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner. And I just heard what Bruce said, and it's true. There's been just a kind of swelling of literature, both fiction and nonfiction, in part, I know, in part as a result of the commission, but also as a part of this reclaiming of voice that I was talking about before. And I think that's an amazing thing. But you asked me about my book. The title itself, you've asked me to explain it. North of Nowhere has to do with a story related to my mother-in-law, who is a very, she's now the late, but she was a woman of the land, and a trapper and hunter, and and lived a very traditional lifestyle. And I lived through the transition in Fort Good Hope when, believe it or not, it was the middle of the 80s before television reception came to that part of Canada. And so I lived through this immediate day and night transformation of the community where everybody was outside playing baseball and visiting each other and all of that. And all of a sudden, everyone's inside and obsessed with this new thing. And I happened to be with her in her house one day, and somebody was talking about the Northwest Territories on the television set. And she kind of blurted out loud to thin air, um, I don't live north of anywhere. I live right here. She said, I don't live north of nowhere. That's what she said. That was her phrase. And she was asserting, and this is why I chose it for the title of the book. It was a phrase that just kept resonating with me. But she was really saying, my world, it may be northwest in Canada, but it may be northwest of the centers of power in Ottawa, but that has nothing to do with my life, which is right here on these lands and waters, right here where I have always lived. And I used it as a metaphor in my book because I feel the big work and the ongoing work of reconciliation, it isn't about what we have to do for somebody else somewhere else, but where do we live, right wherever we are. That's the center of our universe and our sphere of influence. And how do we do what we can do, each of us, in our own way, right where we are, within our own spheres of influence. So I thought it was a powerful metaphor for the overall meaning of reconciliation. And then the second part of it, Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner, partly that's the word song itself was the most carefully chosen of all the words in there, but it really speaks to that part I was talking about before about the incredible gift of reconciliation. There's also a particular story related to why I chose the word song, but it has to do with so many elders teaching, saying your song is your gift or whatever it is you're meant to do. And I decided that what I was meant to do was write the story of the commission to make sure I could help keep it alive. And so that became my song.
Thank you, Marie. And I would recommend anybody read it. It's a wonderful read. Well done. Bruce, what about you?
In terms of books?
Books,
So
engagement.
I mentioned one of them earlier, which was Thomas King's The Inconvenient Indian, which was a real sort of a great entry point for me. I remember reading the Cheney Wenjack story and Five Little Indians. There's been so many great books that have been written. I've got, I can't think of what the name is. I've got one on my bedside table right now that a friend gave to me. So great. A lot of these, whether they're fiction, a lot of them are based in reality of what has happened and the experiences of real people.
It's interesting because oh wait, there's I think we have a question in chat. Let me see what. Oh.
Is there a way to talk about reconciliation that makes it easier to bring up in the day-to-day without undermining its relation to intergenerational trauma?
Ask people to tend. I ask because people tend to shy away from discussion topics that feel heavy, and the heritage of residential school is one of them.
You know, it's interesting. The topic of war is heavy too, and yet we never hesitate to talk about that every single year in this very season of remembrance. And we talk about it in heroic ways. We talk about it in ways that make us feel, of course, sad for personal loss, but proud as a country. I think that, you know, that I've often heard Indigenous people say, and you'll certainly know this, Victoria, people don't want to have a conversation that's sort of a deficits-based conversation, but rather to become better aware of um, extraordinary accomplishments and achievements within the country and heroes in our midst that we've never been taught about or introduced to or even been made aware of. I think even now I find there's a lot in professional sports, a lot of retelling of the stories of people who were always Indigenous, but we didn't know that till recently because that was never part of what we said about anybody. You know, it wasn't something that served anybody well to be able to say as part of their reality. And I think that's part of what you were talking about, Victoria, when you said you wanted for your kids to be able to show up however they are, as they are, and to feel, you know, fully themselves and that they belong. So I don't know. I think we shouldn't be afraid to have conversations about difficult topics, but the question is not to debate the past. There are people who want to deny what happened, and I think we shouldn't shy away from that conversation. On the contrary, we should step forward and call it out for what it is, which is denialism. But I think we can also focus on going forward. What do we do with our present day reality, and what do we do towards the future? That's where all the wealth is, and that's where the opportunity is. And certainly in my book, that's the direction I try to steer us in, because we saw so many examples of people doing extraordinary things despite what they had lived through. And so I think anyone should be. It takes courage. That's a bottom line to the question. It takes courage, but we should find that courage and not. The one thing we tried really hard as a commission is not to create a national blame game or a national shame game, but rather to say, here are the facts. This is what we know. This is what has happened as a consequence. And now where do we go from here in a good way? And assume good in people and try to move it forward. That's what I would simply say.
It's interesting because I think of, there's a time and there's a place and to have a difficult conversation or some of the heavier conversations. I think you have to be ready for them, but I also think you have to really listen. There has to be real deep listening when you're into those kinds of conversations. And you have to allow for quiet. You know, so many times I've been part of conversations or sitting at a table where people are having conversations and somebody wants to talk. There's a difficult they're telling a story and it's a hard story. And instead of bringing the story into yourself, you tend to say, how can I change the story? How can I change the topic? And so I think you have to have moments within yourself where you let it be. I just, that's the only thing I can think of when I think about hard conversations that I've been involved in is allow some space. You got to make space for those things.
I mean, I think part of what's difficult about that question is we're not sure who's raising the topic, you know? So if it's being raised by an Indigenous person, that's a different response in my mind than if somebody's raising it and wanting to shove it aside or dismiss it. And you have a choice there as to how you respond. So, yeah.
Did the Hudson Bay Company recent bankruptcy create an inflection point for new conversations around the weakness of systems and institutions that are transactional and colonial, in contrast with that which is relational? I can't read the rest of it. Circular?
Circular and restorative.
Circular and restorative. It's an interesting question. That you know, I guess as an Indigenous woman and who grew up on a reserve where the Hudson Bay Company was the only game in town, and it was a thriving business. And we sold, my family sold furs there, and it was really, we look in our community, many of us look back at that because we don't have a store anymore in the community. We don't have none of any of that, like that kind of fully operational store. We look at that back with kind of treasured memories, like it was a good thing, we've lost something as a result of losing the store. But at the same time, I also understand the history of the Hudson Bay Company and the fur trade and all of that. So in some ways, is it a great Canadian institution? It is part of the history. It's part of our history, and we can learn from it. And I don't know. It's a tough question. Marie, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I live in a part of the country where for years it was the only store in town, too, as you described. And now in more recent years, but in these past many years, the co-op movement has been important. And so cooperative stores are also very prominent in this part of the country. But the question was around, did it create an inflection point? And I'll just say that the most active conversation that I was aware of, at least as it was talked about in my circles and in the media, was to do with not the history, which nobody can change, but rather about the holdings of the Hudson Bay Company, and particularly those artifacts that people deemed were not theirs to certainly not to sell off or to give away or to use to cover their debts, but rather something that needed to be properly returned. That's the most active and quite vociferous at times conversations that I heard about what was to become of the Hudson Bay Company.
Yeah, it would have been. I think it would have been terrible if all that stuff would have been left in the States. But it is. The Canadian Tire has bought that stuff. It'll be interesting to see how they handle it and what they do with it. Bruce.
It takes you back to the idea of the doctrine of discovery, and the idea that when Europeans came here, that they could just take the land and give it over and give it control to the Hudson Bay Company. So I hadn't heard it. I haven't thought about it framed in the way of an inflection point, because I feel almost like the Hudson Bay Company had been dying the death of 1,000 paper cuts over the last 25 years. And its relevance in society, certainly in history, huge relevance in this country, but its modern day relevance, it had really sort of outgrown its its relevance was much more in the past. But certainly played a crucial role for good and for bad in the development of this country.
Very good.
I'll tell you on a very personal note that one of the things occasionally here and there that the Hudson Bay Company did was provoke community entrepreneurship. And I don't know how singular this story is. I think it's fairly unique, but I know that my husband's grandfather, whom I never knew, unfortunately, but his claim to fame, it wasn't, his point was not to have a claim to fame, but his determination was to be able to compete with the Hudson Bay Company. And he had his own general store, which he set up under his name. And as a result, and I actually touch on a little bit of that story in my book, but he had to give up treaty status in order to be able to take contracts and borrow money and do all those things. And he had a general store and he traded. And the reason I mention it is because I know how significant it was as an inspirational thing. So when something extraordinary can happen, it can inspire many others. And years later, and I never met the man, but because of my husband's name and our family name, I heard stories from communities that were like 700, 800 kilometers away, no road system, right? Who had heard the story of that grandfather's store because it was such an extraordinary thing. And they just saw it as an amazing thing that one little guy could take on the Hudson Bay Company and start his own fur trading shop.
Yeah, and I think that happened in other areas because it certainly happened here. There was a fur trader who the Hudson Bay actually moved in order to, like, it was in one part of the lake and then it moved to another part of the lake, and it had to do with this local guy setting up, doing exactly the same kind of thing. And you're right, it did create entrepreneurship. But one of my favorite stories about entrepreneurship, and back in the day when my grandfather was talking, one time told a story about being somewhere and the guy saying, you know, we can give you $1,000 for that, something he had. And $1,000 back then was huge money. And he looked and he said, that's wonderful that you give me $1,000 for that. It had to do with something he had. And he said, but if I sell you that, I won't be able to do this or this or this. And I have no place to spend $1,000 because there's no stores around me. So you know, some of those stories that you listen to and you realize how people lived. I think we're coming to the end of our time, and I really appreciate Bruce and Marie having you have this conversation. We talked about books. I just want to name two books that have really helped me, or one is River Run by Peter Such, and it's an older book, much older, and it's a story of the Beothuk. And then the other one is Dancing with a Ghost by Rupert Ross, where he talks about the living a circular life versus living a linear life. And he talks about his time up in northwestern Ontario. And it's actually a very good book. It has really helped me think through some of the things when living in a world where I often say I don't plan, or I find that sometimes people make plans and it's not a plan, it's their roadmap. That's what they're going to do. Whatever happens, they're going to get to that place that they go. And I've lived my life where if you make a plan, something's going to happen to change it. You're never going to walk that plan. And so it's an expectation. And I'm married to a non-Indigenous guy who likes to plan and likes to get to on his way. And sometimes I'll say, yeah, I know it's in the plan, but we're not doing it that way. So it is an interesting life. So thank you very much for both of you. Do you have any last words, Bruce?
At this point, I think I've said what I need to, but thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation.
Marie.
Well, I'll just conclude by going back to something that I said earlier on in our conversation, and picking up on the Students on Ice theme, if I may, is that, you know, we are at a time where in many ways our world is on thin ice. And I think each of us who have received the gifts of these experiences and the wealth of benefits that have come from that, and including the wealth of networks that I hope are still vibrant, that it's an opportunity for us to say, what is our place going forward? Not just in a narrow way of reconciliation about Indigenous peoples and all Canadians, but about our place in the human family, and our interaction with all of creation. That's where I hope we will remind ourselves that there's still work to do, and that we all have songs to sing, if I can use that term from my book title, but we all have work to do, and may we find it, and may we continue to be enriched by all of it.
The author of River Run is Peter Such. So I'm going to close because I know if you've been with Students on Ice, the one thing that our founder Jeff Green has said if you've traveled is flexibility is key. So keep going, and thank you, everybody.
Masicho.
Scott, you're on mute.
Scott, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Talking to myself here. I said, Victoria, Bruce, and Marie, thank you so much for your heartfelt conversation today. It was a joy to listen to. You guys are so knowledgeable, and it's such an important conversation to have. So, yeah, big kudos.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Scott. And thank you, Victoria, for the invitation. Nice to see you again, Bruce, really. I
Love to see you.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you all the alumni for who tuned in too. It's we have a streaming of Roger Bull's podcast tomorrow starting at 11 a.m. And then we have Grant Linney's session starting at 1 p.m. So if you folks, anybody is available to listen to that, we'll pick it up tomorrow.
Great. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you so much.